it's now my honour, and I'm really happy to be able to introduce Donna Ockenden. Not that I've been able to say hello to her. Hello. So, I'm sure all of you are familiar with her name. It's sort of it landed in the health service really a few years ago, and in my opinion, it's really made a difference to things. This was in relationship to the maternity services review at Shrewsbury and Telford. And there have been other reviews. I've been in obstetric anaesthetics for a long time. I remember Morecambe Bay and various things like that. But there seems to be something about this one that's really made a difference. And in my opinion, it's moved the labour ward from being a Cinderella specialty within the trust to being actually an area which is reported to boards where the exec board is interested. In previous incarnations, the chief operating officers of hospitals were very focused on the targets in ED, on waiting list targets, things like this. But now actually, and that is why, I'm sure other areas are familiar with, our obstetric theatres always had the old anaesthetic machines. You'd refurbish the stairs and just everything was a bit Cinderella. And now that doesn't seem to be the case. And I really think it is this that's made a difference to your review. And with the review came money. We talked a lot about Ockenden Bunny, and that's obviously made a difference. So I'm really proud to be able to introduce somebody who I really think has made a difference for patient safety. There we go.
Good morning, and it's my huge honour to have been invited to beautiful Yorkshire to talk to you all today. So as you know, my name is Donna Ockenden. I'm a midwife and a nurse, definitely not an anaesthetist. And we've already mentioned this morning the independent review of Shrewsbury and Telford hospitals, and I'm now spending an awful lot of time in Nottingham. Alongside my I think it is full-time work in Nottingham. I'm involved in a number of charities, SANS, MASIC for those women who have anal sphincter injuries, Baby Lifeline, and I founded a charity in my home city of Chichester, providing support for the hungry, the homeless and the vulnerable. I think we're in year 9 now. So that's a little bit about me. So, just a reminder then of the headlines from the second and final Ockenden report in Shrewsbury. And you mentioned there, why did that Ockenden report make a difference? So my gut feel is it was the first time that there'd been a review of maternity services that was truly multi-professional. So initially, this is a bit of a secret, I was asked, will you go and do a midwifery report into Shrewsbury and Telford? And they told me a little bit about the original 23 cases, and I said, not on your life. I'm not going anywhere where there isn't obstetric neonatal and obstetric anaesthesia support. So initially, I turned that review down because they'd asked me to just go and have a look as a midwife. So my multi-professional team of doctors and midwives, and they are the kind of people that you would find in a large maternity unit. They stretched from Leeds in the north to Plymouth in the southwest. At the end of the review, I was told off by people in Newcastle who said to me, you do know that the north doesn't stop at Leeds? And I was told off by people down in Cornwall who said, can we just remind you that the southwest doesn't stop at Plymouth? So now, my geography's improved, but now we have a multi-professional team stretching from Newcastle in the north down to Cornwall in the southwest, and I can tell you that as of today there are 10 obstetric anaesthetists on my team who I am really, really proud of. So you will know that the multi-professional team found repeated failures in the quality of care and governance of the trust, and a failure of external bodies to effectively monitor that care and spot the signs that there was something going wrong here. We all know that we are overseen, looked at, examined by so many external bodies, but it took some parents to raise the alarm. The Trust had more than 60 local actions for learning, and I was really delighted to hear about the improvements that are already being seen in obstetric anaesthesia. And we're not done yet. You will all know, you are on the front line, you will know that there are 15 areas still requiring urgent attention. And I'm not going anywhere, you may be pleased to know, until all of that work is done. So, the final report was published on the 30th of March, just over 2 years ago. And a really key thing is that on the day the report was published, Sajid Javid, as Secretary of State, stood up in the House of Commons and fully endorsed all our findings. For those of you who have seen many reports over many years, that's really, really unusual. Generally, what government will do is consider, think, push the report into the long grass, come back 6 months later. But I'd met him the week before. He was very generous with his time, even though he was Secretary of State. And I'd met Jeremy Hunt on many occasions, who again was very generous with his time and his support of our work. The question I always ask, and again have a think about this, you know, we're in your NHS trusts, why, with all the oversight that there is of maternity, or let's call it perinatal services, did it take 2 sets of bereaved parents, Richard and Rhiannon, the mum and dad of Kate, should have been born a healthy term baby, and Kaylee and Colin, the parents of Pippa, an avoidable death of a term baby. Why did it take them to spot the warning signs? Why didn't our multiple oversight systems actually work? And could this happen in your trust today? So I always ask people, please have a think about that. So you mentioned the Cinderella service, and this is how maternity felt. There's Cinderella, she's on a hard stone floor, she's got a raggy old dress, she's shoved down, you know, in the cellar by the fireplace. And that was how maternity services felt for me for a large part of my career. I first became a head of midwifery in 1999, and I had enormous difficulty trying to get the board to listen about the difficulties in my service. And all of you will know these are the issues that are facing us on a daily basis. Our workforce is tired, we're short of key people. My understanding is that most obstetric rotas across the UK have got gaps in them, and we know that we've got a shortage of midwives. From the colleagues I talk to on a daily basis, women are becoming more complex. There's a greater acuity in the women that come to our front doors. And of course, we hear every day, we will see every day that inequalities and deprivation in this country are increasing. And these women are going to come to the front doors of our maternity units. Maternity isn't an island. We can't kind of pretend that what's happening out there doesn't then come in and meet you guys on a daily basis. We've had more than a decade of underfunding, but I think on a positive note, I think perinatal services are now higher profile than at any time in my career. So whereas we may still have many, many issues, there is no escaping the fact that maternity services do need to improve, and this is known at the highest level of government. So, birth rates are falling, but complexity is rising, and attrition in all professions is a concern. The frontline staff that I talk to, and I do make it my business, I talk to and listen to frontline clinical staff pretty much every day of the week. They talk about the need to meet their physical needs, so they say to me, never mind a lunch break, we haven't had a loo break today, Donna. And you all know that that is true, but also the psychological needs. Midwives, obstetric anaesthetists, obstetricians tell me that they end their shifts exhausted, burnt out, and frightened sometimes for the care that they haven't been able to give. And of course everything that needed to happen was made worse by the COVID pandemic, and we still have that overhang from the effects of the COVID pandemic even today. So I spoke to a really treasured colleague of mine, a consultant obstetric anaesthetist recently, and she said to me, do you know, every day we're asked to go into our labour ward and do the almost impossible. And that is in a trust that the CQC tells her is outstanding. So, Embrace you will be very, very familiar with. We're seeing that women living in deprived areas continue to have the highest maternal mortality. Suicide is the leading direct cause of death, and Black and Asian women have a much higher chance of dying in pregnancy. So again, those issues of deprivation presenting at our front door, sometimes with really, really tragic consequences. So, thinking about the roles of families, you might think, where's Towel Van? Well, I can tell you this was the first independent review. I'm a nurse and a midwife, and Towel Van was an older person's mental health ward in deepest North Wales, in an NHS unit where, following on concerns shared by relatives, I uncovered the most shocking institutional abuse. Then there was Shrewsbury and Telford, and then we're now in Nottingham. This is Dr. Jack Hawkins. He was a consultant at Nottingham. His and Sarah's first daughter, Harriet, died. This is the birth of their second baby, Lottie, and this is baby Winter Andrews in Nottingham, who lived only 23 minutes after she was born. But there is an ongoing issue. Families have to be fight to be heard. And I have no doubt whatsoever the Shrewsbury and Telford review and the Nottingham review would not have happened without the activism of families. What that did to them, the personal cost that they endured, is huge and remains huge. Interestingly, so Towel Van, I completed that report in 2013. It's under the leadership of Welsh Government, and only this week one of the nurses found guilty by the NMC of kicking an elderly patient out of the ward office because he was a bit of a nuisance, has just been struck off. But that's taken 11 years for an elderly man's family to fight the system in order for justice to be done. We know the outcomes from the Shrewsbury report. 201 babies and 9 mothers could have had better outcomes. And then there's a little bit of coverage there around Nottingham. I think it's really important to say that throughout both the Shrewsbury and Telford review and the Nottingham review, the media played a very, very, I think, fair hand. There's very little in terms of sensational headlines. If you look, what the media picked up on really clearly was the need for service improvement, was the need for government to fund, and was the need for England-wide action. But here we go, back to Nottingham. Families are still fighting. I get asked weekly, will you come and review our maternity services? And I said, well, I can't do that. It isn't up to me to decide what I do. It's a decision by the Secretary of State, but I have been contacted by a number of Derby families, Sussex families and others recently. And some of the early findings from Nottingham, without a doubt, I am hearing from mothers evidence of systemic racism within Nottingham. I'm just going to say it how it is. Interestingly, the staff at Nottingham are also reporting that to me as well. So let's have a look then at how we ensured that the voices of all women and families across Nottingham were heard. So we started with a methodology that required families to write to the trust, bizarre, if they wanted to be part of the independent review. So these figures are a little bit small, but just bear with me. Of the cases that we knew met the terms of reference, we managed initially to get hold of just over 28% of white women, 10% of black women, 5% of Asian women, and 2% of other. So we were 6 months into the review. There'd been a methodology put in place involving women having to make a huge amount of effort to contact us via the trust. And I just said, no way, we're not doing this. I am not prepared to stand up and publish a report that says, well, we managed to reach 10% of the known affected black women and 5% of Asian women. So I had to take a really strong stand and say, I'm not doing this, we have to do things differently. So why was representation in the Nottingham Review initially so very, very low? Well, I think here are the answers. The original letters were sent by the trust. Some women recognised the typeface on the envelope and wouldn't open it. They were so traumatised and so frightened. The letters were written in English only. Nottingham has a very rich, diverse population. This was never going to work. And families had to then write back to the trust to give consent. So the methodology that was originally set up by NHS England was doomed to fail. And something that will be covered in the final report is why, when we'd had a very successful report in Shrewsbury, did NHS England tell us that we had to do something different in Nottingham. But we didn't in the end, we did change. So what do we do to fix it, to make sure that all voices that want to be heard in Nottingham will be heard? I wrote personally to over 2,000 women. We did an awful lot of in-person community engagement led by the women themselves. This is one of our women being filmed for an informational video. I think this was in Arabic, but she wanted to face away from the screen. We took an all-female camera crew. And I was out and about in Nottingham, at mosques, gurdwaras, the Nottingham Women's Centre, and we offer face-to-face interpretation throughout the review as required. The women led the way in Nottingham, filming their own videos with us, telling their own communities about the importance of this review, and telling their fellow women and families, come forward, this is for Nottingham, this is for Nottingham mothers and families. And so engagement and interaction continues to improve daily, but what I would say is trust is hard won, easily lost, and I'm very aware that I need to maintain these efforts. And staff. You will know I've got a multi-professional team of over 100 members of staff now, so my review team covers, as I said, every specialty that you'd find in a typical large hospital like Leeds. So I've got a urologist, I've got a neurologist, a number of obstetric physicians, and as I said, my 10 very precious obstetric anaesthetists. So for them, as ordinary doctors and midwives and nurses on the ground, they care deeply that staff voices in Nottingham will be heard and acted upon. So we've had about 720 staff contact us. You can see, in terms of numbers, about half are midwives, there's nurses, obstetricians, anaesthetics. We've got quite a few anaesthetists have contacted us, peds and neonates, and then other. So we're continuing to work on that, and at the moment, my team are offering virtual meetings for staff that would like to do more than just sending emails and fill in the survey. And what we say is that if you are an anaesthetist that wants to come forward, I guarantee you that you'll get the opportunity to talk to two of the anaesthetists in my team. So essentially, someone who gets your clinical environment, will understand the pressures, will listen to you about your concerns. And touch wood, fingers crossed, so far the approach is working. So again, looking at ethnicity, the big blue blob is white. Staff are more likely to come forward when they are white, but we are continuing to work on that to encourage staff of minority ethnic backgrounds to come forward. So again, in terms of ensuring that staff voices are heard, it's never a done deal. We're not going to say, well, we've done staff voices, that's it, tick the box, we've got 720 members of staff come forward. That this is an ongoing effort. So, you asked me to talk to you about how maternity teams work together to implement the IEA's immediate and essential actions. I don't do recommendations, and I feel that having heard from Sajid Javid, and it's on the parliamentary record, that the government fully endorsed all Ockenden's findings, I will continue in my effort to support maternity teams on the ground to implement these IEAs. And anyone who works in Hull, I'm going to see you this afternoon. So, these are just a couple of examples. There are so many examples of multi-professional teams working together. So this is one from London, Barkinghaven and Redbridge. I think that's another London one, that might be the Whittington. But I've been to Bristol, I've been to Plymouth, say Hull this afternoon. I've been all over the country, and I believe passionately that staff voices, so many of you will know the solutions, and so I do listen very carefully. and then escalate those staff voices as appropriate right to the top of government. But I do see lots of examples, and you know, obstetric anaesthesia is at the heart of all of the teams that work together well. So how are we going to ensure that we see that change in perinatal services? I don't talk about maternity services, perinatal, around birth, and you are all a vital part of that. So pretty much every day of the week, I talk to frontline staff across England. I talk to families every day as well. I'm absolutely dedicated to continuing liaison with both the Royal Colleges and the professional organisations. So hearing about the changes in obstetric anaesthesia, I'm delighted with that, because in the months leading up to publication of Final Ockenden in Shrewsbury, we were in touch with the OAA, Nuala Lucas and co, on a really, really regular basis. So I knew that when the report was published, and we'll continue that, I'm still in touch with the OAA, and RCOA, RCOG, Royal College of Midwives and so on now, we knew that when the report was published, the OAA, RCOA was not going to be looking and going, oh God, where did she get that from? What a pile of old rubbish. In fact, the opposite happened. And I think it's the first time I can remember that all of the Royal Colleges, all of the professional organisations, led by Chris Elton, I think, fully endorsed Ockenden. So not only did we get that full endorsement from government and the families, we got that full endorsement. And I think that ongoing, I'm the kind of front face of the review, that ongoing contact with your professional organisations, with you on the ground, is vital. I use my influence to work with policymakers, NHS England, government, and the parties on the opposite green benches. And I use, effectively, professional media, regional and national, so on, to get clear messages across. I've just been interviewed for the RCOG podcast, and I think they're going to be writing something about me in the autumn. And this is a huge compliment. I've been told in the past, in the recent past actually, what we like about you is you're no nonsense, you take no mess in, and you're a real common sense advocate for safer perinatal care. So if that is what people write on my gravestone, hopefully that's not going to come too soon, but if that is what people say about me and it works, then it's my huge honour and privilege to do that. So, what do we do to ensure ongoing equality? We do our best each and every day to promote family and staff voices, and it's my mission to improve maternity and perinatal care for everyone, for voices that often haven't been heard, and that can be staff voices as well. And by listening to families and staff, and by bringing people together, this was a family meeting in Nottingham recently. We filled a very large hall on a Saturday morning, and we've got another one in June. But by listening to families, listening to staff, bringing people together, my promise to you is that improvement is possible, and I'm not going anywhere until I can look in the mirror one morning, and I might be quite a bit older by then, but I will be able to say every woman in this country has safe maternity care. Thank you. I go every night for a little walk around Nottingham, and I always say good night to the city of Nottingham before I go off to my bed. So, you know, what will you all do? What have you learned? What will you say? And I think, have we got some time for questions to say what needs to happen next?
Thank you. Right, questions. There's a roving mic. We'll start there.
I'm not sure it's right.
Yeah.
Can you say who you are and where you come from as well?
Yeah, so my name's Dan. I'm one of the anaesthetic registrars. I'm in York at the moment, hospital. So I've got a couple of things to ask. First of all, thank you very much. I thought I was really convincing as to the purpose that you're on and the purpose of equality and reducing inequality. And on that matter, you're not the only convincing figure to have suggested that inequality is a massive factor in the problems we're seeing as healthcare professions in the population. given your experience with dealing with two very senior ministers who have been health secretaries, the one question that I wanted to ask was, given the 14 years of austerity that they've overseen and the problems that we are now seeing, how convinced are they that austerity and the agenda that's been brought by the current government have contributed to the problems that your review have encountered in the locations you found? And with that, what are, in your view, the solutions from a systemic level to those problems with inequality in accessible services?
Okay. So a couple of breakdowns to that then. First of all, I never ever sweet talk anyone. So the secretaries, I've met Steve Barclay, Jeremy Hunt, Sajid Javid. I'm still awaiting my invitation to meet Miss Atkins, but anyway, but I'm sure that'll come. Is that on there?
Yeah, I'll say it up.
Oh, right. I'm sure that'll come. So I never sweet talk, I never kind of sugarcoat things. What is really important to me is being able to provide authentic examples from the ground. So when I went to Bradford last year, any of you worked at Bradford? Where you've got the Ask Betty food bank bags in the antenatal clinic, I told Minister about that and I told Secretary of State about that. I also never shirk away from the fact that more deprived women are having worse outcomes. And I just keep those messages consistently coming. So it is really important that I get the opportunity to meet colleagues like you, to come to your hospitals, to talk to the women, so that I'm seen as a credible person. I also meet with the Labour front bench on a fairly regular basis. And I mean, we don't know what will happen. What I can say to you is that team are preparing, as required, I'm being diplomatic here, to lead maternity perinatal services effectively from day one. If I just leave it at that. And then what was the second bit of your question? So I mean, basically my efforts are ongoing and will continue in that regard. What was the second bit?
The second bit of the question is around systemic issues.
Yeah.
So your report is not in isolation. We've seen a number of systemic cover-ups with victims not being able to apply justice, and that goes back far-reaching, thinking about Hillsborough in 1989, and there have been a number of occasions which have taken the press recently. Again, really, what systemic issues do we need to address in order to get people fair access to justice and equitable access to resources?
So I think in terms of systemic issues, essentially we've got to build a better country, haven't we? We've got to build a better, kinder, fairer country. I mean, just a personal aside, I mean, I've been reading in the news this week about plans, government plans, let's hope they never get put in place, to reduce access to what's known as PIP, personal independence payments. I have a daughter with significant learning disabilities and epilepsy, and trying to navigate that universal, she's 20 now, so that personal independence payment, that universal credit, that housing benefit, it is a nightmare. I did 15 tweets and copied in the Secretary of State recently saying how very difficult it was. So I get it from a personal perspective. I think that all of us, and that includes our Royal Colleges, our professional associations, we need to work together, we need to speak with one voice, and I think there is a greater emphasis on that now, and we need to stand together, and I'll pledge to play my part in that.
Thank you. Simon? Yes, of course.
Hi, Simon Old York. Thank you for all you've done and for the presentation. I've read your reports and the bullet points you think about listening to women and communication, not bullying in the workplace. And the last thing, I work in a hospital where I'd like to think there's good teamwork, I'd like to think we listen to women, I'd like to think that women are given choice, but we have failings. But most of those failings due to lack of staffing, lack of manpower, and that's due to lack of funding. And you pointed out the fact it's been 10 years worth of underfunding. I just wondered where we are on the elephant in the room. Is what we really need to improve our service locally is more money and more people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's why immediately essential action 1 was for the government to commit to sufficient funding. So just in terms of a potted history of this, the Select Committee in 2021, chaired by a gentleman, Jeremy Hunt, basically said that right then, in June 2021, maternity services, so not perinatal, maternity services needed up to £350 million of funding. That was to be kept under review, reviewed annually, and paid immediately. So where are we now in 2024, 3 years later? NHS England have invested around 180 million. So at the very best, we are halfway there. We also have to think about things like increased staff costs, increased inflation, and so on. So what I do, which I think still is very important, is every opportunity I get, and I think it does irritate a few people, I say progress is inadequate in meeting the immediate and essential actions. I remind them that Jeremy Hunt himself published the report in June 2021 as chair of the Select Committee, and I basically say we are around halfway there, and I will keep talking about that in terms of money and workforce. I work really closely with RCOG and the Royal College of Midwives. We know that in a typical week across England, midwives and maternity support workers do around 100,000 hours of unpaid overtime. And so what I do in terms of my role is if I know that I'm going to get an opportunity to go on the Today programme or Newsnight or whatever, I make sure I'm really, really well briefed. I have Nuala Lucas on speed dial. I check everything out with her in case I get the opportunity to say something unsettled. The same with RCM, the same for RCOG. So we are getting there, but far, far too slowly. And I think one of the phrases that I think now we all need to focus on is zero avoidable harm. And that's exactly what you are talking about. We know that with the very best care, some women will have very poor outcomes. But it's looking at that avoidable harm, and I think that that is where we need to make that journey. So I'll keep going, I'll do my best. I need the help of all you guys on the ground, and I'm committed to working with colleagues just on an ongoing and daily basis. Any more questions?
Yes, somebody at the back there.
Hi, my name's Andrew McKendry. I'm a consultant at Bradford Royal Infirmary. Thank you very much for your time today. So that was very interesting talking to say. I agree with someone else saying it's very convincing all the data you have. One thing I know, I'm fortunate, or some would say unfortunate, enough to be married to a midwife. And certainly I'm just a jobbing obstetric anaesthetist, and you mentioned about avoidable harm. I, as a jobbing anaesthetist, if I see potential for that, in an area where that could be a possibility, it's very easy for me to raise that and for that to be very quickly addressed. My wife, on the other hand, say she's a band 6 experienced midwife, but it's much more difficult for her to escalate those concerns, and certainly I have no issues raising that problems. She, on the other hand, hits brick walls everywhere she goes, and this is the experience of all of her sort of equivalent midwives. As sort of senior clinicians who have power to do things, what can we do as clinicians to help support those, particularly midwives or other members of staff who don't necessarily have that power to raise those concerns, or especially in areas where those concerns don't really want to be heard?
That's a really, really good question, and yes, there is that hierarchy. We know that those perceived to be, at the top of the tree then, are sometimes enabled to raise concerns more effectively than workforce such as midwives, student midwives, maternity support workers, and so on. I think the first thing to say is that if your wife and others have used all the available structures, so the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian, in discussions with the Director of Midwifery, and onwards to the board. If they've used all those available structures, then I think they have to raise issues externally. So I would encourage people to speak to the Royal College of Midwives. They're running a campaign at the moment around effective speaking out in the workplace. And you know, failing that, email me, because I do anonymously, as required, raise concerns directly to the top of NHS England. I do it probably every couple of weeks, and I do think it is really, really important that those voices are not silenced. And until we get a structure that really does work, that's what I have to do, that is what I will do. It shouldn't have to be that way, but I think all of us would accept that in some units, for some staff, it is that way. And interestingly, in Nottingham, every couple of weeks I get contacted by what I call ordinary staff on the ground saying, we need your help because actually we're hitting a brick wall. Despite all the veneer and the gloss and the fact that the board is supporting everything Ockenden says, ordinary members of staff are contacting me directly as well with their issues. So your wife and her colleagues are not on their own, but I will help if needed.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, a question in the middle there.
Hi, I'm Louise. I'm a consultant anaesthetist in Nottingham.
You're welcome. Maybe you can fill me in then on that.
I just wanted to, as you correctly said, that in both Shrewsbury and Nottingham, that you had really brave parents who sort of persisted in getting their cases heard so that reviews occurred. But as we've also heard from other people here, their trusts aren't working in ideal circumstances easily as well. So in your position of power and the ears that you have, so you've mentioned Nuala from our group, but also the midwifery, RCN, NHS England and people in the government, should we just say, let's have a national review so we're not relying on these poor traumatised families having to speak up?
So that's a really good question. Well, they're all good questions, really good questions. And I know that some of the Nottingham families and then other families from Barnsley, other places are pushing at the moment for a national inquiry. And I appreciate where they are coming from. My only concern is that had all the immediately essential actions from Ockenden in Shrewsbury been fully met by now, because we are 2+ years down the line, if all the funding had been put in place, if we were well on the way to recruiting and retaining all the workforce, etc., we could be in a much better place. And my concern with the idea of a national, England-wide inquiry, and we hear it all the time, on the news in the morning, is we must wait for the findings of the inquiry. I mean, how many years have we been hearing that with infected blood, the post office, Hillsbury, you mentioned? We must wait for the national inquiry. So my concern is, and I have explained this to the families who are calling for this, is that then progress on the immediately essential actions, progress on getting the funding, progress on workforce will stop because we're waiting for the national inquiry. So I understand exactly where you're coming from, and I do, please believe me, I know, talking to colleagues across England, that there are many, many units in significant difficulty. But yeah, I think that a national inquiry could slow things down and push things into the long grass rather than progress things very, very quickly. That's the issue.
I think we've got time for one more question down there.
Time's up.
No, it's not. Someone's getting a text on it.
Thank you, Donna. Having identified that black and Asian women come to harm, sorry, Paul, by the way, anaesthetist from Leeds.
Yeah.
Having identified that black and Asian women come to harm more often than their white counterparts in lots of areas of healthcare, are there any key material things we can do on a day-to-day basis to reduce that risk and act and kind of educate our colleagues to bring that risk down? For instance, we've heard from our high-risk clinic colleagues that we can identify patients who are at risk and put resources in place to make plans. Do we need to invite those women to high-risk clinics, for instance, and put stuff in place before they get to delivery suite? So in your experience, what material actions can we do to close that gap?
So I'm up in Nottingham a couple of times a month, and on each of those visits I meet with black and brown skinned women, usually in their homes, usually with an interpreter. And what they tell me is that most of the time, in most of the clinical scenarios in Nottingham, and again this is, I'm sure that this is an issue across the country, there isn't the availability of an interpreter. They can't understand what is happening. They can't give informed consent to what is about to happen to them, and that is where the issues start. I think also what women and their families, because I quite often meet their husbands, their sisters, their brothers and so on, what there is still in this country, and again the government politics that we're hearing, the rhetoric, it's not rhetoric though, is it, that we're hearing from government doesn't help this. There is a mistrust amongst many of these women about health services, systems and structures and so on. So I think the first thing, the local thing that needs to happen in all of our trusts, and I will speak out about this, is ensuring that women's voices can be heard and ensuring that they understand what it is needs to happen. But then underneath that, we've got the words that are out there every day telling these women they're not wanted in this country, they really should go home, wherever home is. Home is usually Leeds, Bradford, Bristol and so on, but there is the rhetoric is suggesting something different. And a lack of trust. I try really hard to work with local communities. We know that works really, really well in terms of uptake of the COVID vaccine, for example. But it is about working with local communities, knowing your local communities, and doing your best with that. But it is complex. It is complex.
Thank you. That's been really, really good. Thank you very much. I feel very inspired.